Marion Smith, Executive Director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Marion, we thank you for joining us via Skype. What do you make of these bellicose remarks from the Russian Federation?
Well, I think it's just another example that Vladimir Putin views the United States and its allies as enemies. And I think this goes back in some measure, and in great measure perhaps, to his interpretation of the Cold War and how that ended. What we see that's going on in Ukraine right now is Vladimir Putin's attempt to roll back some of the consequences of the Cold War when Ukraine became a free and independent country with all of its territory as part of Ukraine, including Crimea.
Well, the Deputy Foreign Minister offered this comment specifically: we will be forced to undertake all necessary political and military measures to reliably safeguard our security. The words of Vladimir Titov. And as you hear that from Minister Titov, it was my experience during the days of the Cold War in studying Soviet politics that certain people, I don't want to say they were apologists for the Soviet Union, but they would say, hey, you got to remember what's gone on with Russia, especially in the context of World War II and the Nazi invasion and what happened on the so-called Russian front. So the Russians historically are very concerned about anyone around their border. Now, granted, that is a charitable interpretation to say the least. What do you think is the more realistic reality of these pronouncements?
Well, history is not fair to any country. History is imperfect for everyone, and every country does look after its own interests. But the United States, in the Cold War was leader of the free world, and we saw our interests not just in our material interests, but in some sense of justice. And the Soviet Union was not morally equivalent to the United States throughout the Cold War. And so it's a good thing that the United States came out of that intact, and it's a good thing that the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1990 and 91, and that the captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe were freed in 1989 and 1990. So all of these things are good developments in the history of recent world politics, and I think they need to be preserved. The post-Cold War order has meant an awful lot of growth and prosperity for most European countries. Not perfect, no system is perfect. But wars have consequences, and the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, and we can go back to almost any country's history and find a time when they were more or less greater than they are now. But that doesn't necessarily justify any claim of action at the moment.
When we hear Vladimir Titov talk about all necessary political and military measures to safeguard our security, is that essentially a pretext for more expansion into the Ukraine?
It does sound like it. And of course, Russia right now under Vladimir Putin is committed to maintaining their sphere of influence de jure or de facto in Ukraine. And we believe that they'll do whatever they think they need to do. And I believe the Russian people believe that they're going to defend that. George Kennan in his long telegram said that the Soviet Union, and talking about Russian leadership, was impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force. And I think the same is true in the case of Vladimir Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine. I think that the United States and NATO has to make it very clear that although Ukraine is not a member of NATO and those sorts of Article 4, Article 5 enactments can't be triggered, nevertheless, what is happening in Ukraine has direct consequences for the status of NATO allies in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which also have significant Russian-speaking populations. And those are NATO allies, and the United States is by treaty obligated to enforce and defend their security.
Marion, President Obama and then Secretary of State Clinton famously talked about a reset button with Russia, but it seems the reset has been an American policy being far more indulgent of what is transpiring in terms of Russian adventurism. Could the same be said for NATO now that former Norwegian Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg has been named as the new head of NATO? Are you concerned about his leadership potential?
I think that the NATO allied countries in Central and Eastern Europe are actually pretty clear-headed on this question. I think if you look at the actions of Poland, or again the Baltic states, of Hungary, of Czech Republic, I think these are countries that are indicating that they understand that their security and their future security and also their recent history indicate that a strong line must be taken towards Vladimir Putin to let him know that it's not acceptable, that the consequences of the end of the Cold War as it ended would be rolled back now, 25 years later.
Marion, about a minute and a half remaining. Your organization is giving the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom to 2 Ukrainian leaders this year. Can you tell us about those leaders whom you're honoring?
Absolutely. One is Miroslav Mironovich, who was a dissident throughout the Soviet Union days of Ukraine, in Western Ukraine. He was sentenced 7 times, served 6 different prison sentences there under the Soviet Union. Mustafa Zhemilev was deported with his family from Crimea in the 1940s when he was 6 months old, and then later, after the Soviet Union dissolved, went back to Crimea. Both of these individuals suffered under Soviet communism, and today they find themselves confronting Russian incursion into their country yet again after years of fighting for rule of law and civil society there in their native Ukraine.
Marion Smith, Executive Director of the Victim of Communism Memorial Foundation, we thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Communism alive and well in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. China, I'm interested in your take on these years following the Cold War. The new face of communism, is it basically the same result, the same threat to the United States? Why don't you tweet me your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. You can also email us. Our address, connect@newsmaxtv.com. And let's not forget Facebook. You have that available as well to communicate with us via social media here at America's Forum.